Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today we're on the estate planning of the rich and famous topic, and for today's episode, we're going to dive into what happened following the death of Doris Duke. To be honest, it is a name that I didn't really immediately recognize, but while she may not be as well known as some other figures that we have done here on celebrity estate planning episodes, there is, absolutely no denying her wealth. According to a Forbes article, Doris, who died in 1993, passed away with about a 1.3 billion, with a B as in boy, billion fortune. Now, I've had a lot of celebrities on these episodes, have multiple millions, but very few have dipped into the billions. Well, Doris Duke gets added to that short list. So let's talk a little bit about Doris as a person first, and then get into what happened following her passing and what we can learn from what did end up happening. According to her Wikipedia page, this is how they describe Doris. She was an, quote, American billionaire tobacco heiress, philanthropist, art collector, horticulturalist, and socialite. She was often called the richest girl in the world, end quote. So Doris was the only child of James Buchanan Duke and Nanaline Holt Inman, which was James's second wife. At James's passing, a majority of his estate was distributed to Nanaline and to Doris. Most of Doris's childhood was spent growing up on Duke Farms, which was a 2,700-acre property in New Jersey. Through James's estate proceeding, Doris actually ended up successfully suing her mother and other executors of James's estate to block the sale of various real estate. One of the pieces at issue was a mansion in Manhattan, which later became the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, which is kind of a cool fun fact. Later on, when her mother, Nanaline, passed away, Doris got some of her personal property, so like jewelry, for example, and yet another, large chunk of change. Using her wealth distributed from her father and mother, she actually did a lot of good. She worked at a canteen in Egypt for literally $1 a year. She became a wildlife refugee supporter, She was really a big supporter of that community. She developed an interest in horticulture and started Duke Gardens, which is a public garden. And that's just to name a few. She could have done a lot worse things with her money, right? Through her life, Doris married 2 times and got divorced 2 times. Ultimately, she passed away technically a single woman. In 1985, Doris met a lady named Shandy Hefner, who was 32 years old at the time. And according to biography.com, Doris believed that Shandy was the reincarnation of her daughter Arden, which Arden had passed away as a tiny infant. I think actually I read somewhere that Arden died one day after Doris had her. So Doris really became fixated on the fact that Shandy was Arden reincarnated, according to biography.com. In 1988, when Doris was 76 years old, Doris adopted Shandy, making Shandy, technically speaking, a legal daughter of Doris. Around this point in time, Shandy introduced Doris to Bernard Lafferty, which will be an important name to remember, and Bernard became Doris's butler. In 1992, Doris had done a facelift procedure, and after the procedure, she was on some medications that really caused her to be a bit dizzy. She fell, broke some bones, and ultimately found herself in the operating room for surgery. After surgery or 2 later, she went home after a stint in the hospital and had a severe stroke, which resulted in cardiac arrest. Sadly, Doris ended up passing away on October 28, 1993, at the age of 80. After her passing, an estate plan was located. So at least we don't have yet another celebrity estate planning episode where the celebrity did not have a plan. Though, even though Doris did have an estate plan, that unfortunately did not eliminate drama from happening. According to a Los Angeles Times article, Doris left a last will and testament which named many charitable organizations as beneficiaries. Some were existing and some were brand new. That was not all too startling because through Doris's life, she was very giving in nature with her time and money to causes that she was really passionate about. Perhaps most strange, though, about Doris's will was who she named as her estate's executor. Now, you remember that butler, right? Bernard? It was him. When it was time to get things rolling, Bernard turned around and named a trust company, U.S. Trust, as co-executor with him. After Doris's estate really got rocking and rolling, that's when lawsuits started flooding in. One lawsuit was brought by Shandy, the young woman that she adopted when Doris was 76 years old. And Shandy was contesting the will because Doris had specified that she actually did not want Shandy as a beneficiary due to their falling out. There are some sources that claim that Doris even attempted to negate the adoption, but even though Doris tried to, one, write Shandy out, and two, negate the adoption, Shandy's lawsuit against the estate was at least somewhat successful because Shandy and the estate ultimately settled, which gave Shandy $65 million. Another couple of smaller lawsuits, before we get to the big one involving old Bernard, first was a nurse by the name of Tammy Payette, came out and said that Bernard and a high-up Beverly Hills doctor, Dr. Charles Kivowitz, just look at the source links and you can see how that's spelled, had, according to Wikipedia, quote, conspired to hasten Duke's death with morphine and Demerol. Though, ultimately, the district attorney's office got involved and found there was no evidence of foul play. The other smallerish lawsuit involved Duke University. So they claimed that they were entitled to a larger share of Doris's estate. Honestly, I tried to look to find out what gave them the thought that they were possibly entitled to more, but I couldn't really find too much. But I did find an interesting whole webpage on Doris Duke on Duke University, their library website, which I found really interesting. I linked it in the source links for this episode, a direct link to that webpage. It has some really cool pictures of Doris when she was a kid. There's some family pictures on there, some pictures of some of her family's land, like Duke Farms, which I mentioned earlier. So yeah, go check that out. Yet another lawsuit, which really was the most dramatic piece of Doris's estate, was brought by Doris's doctor, Harry Demopuelos, who, prior to Doris changing her will to appoint Bernard as the executor, Harry was actually appointed as the executor in the prior will. Harry contested the will and estate too, and specifically argued that Bernard had schemed his way into becoming the one in control of Doris's estate. Now, according to Wikipedia, the estate was litigated for about 3 years, which to me is actually not that bad with everything that's going on. I'm surprised it wasn't longer. And there were about 40 lawyers and 40 lawyers and 10 law firms involved, which the legal fees ended up being around $10 million, which were paid by the estate. Ultimately, the court ended up removing Bernard and U.S. Trust as the executors. And according to an article that LegalZoom put out, Bernard was removed, quote, for using estate funds for his own support. And U.S. Trust, that trust company that was appointed as co-executor, was also removed for failing to do anything to stop Bernard, quote, end quote. In lieu of Bernard and U.S. Trust, the court appointed, among a few others, Harry, the doctor. And ultimately, a majority of Doris's wealth and estate went to fund the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. I caught an article in the Los Angeles Times that primarily was about Bernard, and it was a piece written shortly after Bernard himself died. So Doris, if you remember, died in 1993. Bernard actually ended up dying just a mere 3 years later after Doris in 1996. I happened to be skimming that article, and it referenced that through all the craziness and drama regarding Bernard serving as executor, there ultimately was a settlement agreement that was reached between Bernard, the estate, and those contesting the will and estate. The Los Angeles piece about Bernard's death, it referenced that part of the settlement agreement was that Bernard received a bequest of $500,000 a year per the agreement, removing him as executor. Furthermore, the article also shares that Bernard received around $4.5 million in, quote, executor fees. And lastly, the article referenced a gated mansion worth around $2 million that Bernard resided in at his passing. You know, he didn't do too bad for someone that did not know Doris for all too long, and, was her butler. The article mentioned that they are unsure if Bernard had an estate plan, and, with that being said, where his estate would end up going. My nerdy brain and nosy self would love to know that. Now, as we start to wrap this episode up, I think the big takeaway from this Legal Tea episode on Doris Duke is two things. First, you absolutely should think long and hard about who is going to serve as the one in charge. Second, consider putting stipulations in place on how an executor is compensated. So let's start with the first one. I think all too often people's brains just default to children or the oldest child to serve as the one in charge. When in fact, from my seat and my perspective, I really don't care if someone is family or not. Instead, I'd be looking for certain skill sets and attributes in a person. If a child happens to have those skill sets and attributes, then great. And I also don't know who needs to hear this, but picking one child is not picking a favorite. I promise. Serving in the executor is a lot of work. It will take that person a lot of time and energy. So in fact, I'm not sure it's picking the favorite or maybe the actual opposite. Then, from a compensation standpoint, that person is absolutely entitled to a compensation. But there are sort of two popular methods of computing a compensation for serving in this role, at least here in Indiana. The first popular type of computing a compensation is to track time and take an hourly fee. You and your estate plan could even put in what you think is a fair hourly rate. That way, it takes the burden off of them on what they think they should take. The second popular type of computing a compensation is a set fee, and it'd be about half-ish of what the attorney is getting as their fee. Now, there are pros and cons about both of these computations, so if you're serving in this executor role and going to take a compensation, first of all, don't feel bad. Take a fee. And second, lean on your attorney to help determine what a fair and reasonable fee is and how to compute what your fee will be. Just don't be like Bernard. It sounds like he possibly took advantage of the situation, and if that did happen, just don't be like Bernard, okay? Alrighty, I think we're ready to wrap this episode up. Next week, we're back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real-life clients and real-life cases that I or my office have actually worked on. During that episode, we're going to be talking about a case where a client, waited until the absolute 11th hour to do an estate plan. They were in the hospital, and ultimately, we didn't get the plan signed because he was not of sound mind. So next week, we're going to talk about that story and dive into when it becomes too late, which is way more of a gray area than you probably think, like as to whether someone is of sound mind or not. So tune in for that next Tuesday, next week. Until then, Legal Tea listeners, take care and be well.